Okay, let's take another set of notes. We're going to move into chapter 52. Notice that we don't do every section. The textbook does not perfectly align with what AP wants you to know. So there's some things in it that we aren't required to know. And if we're not, then we don't go over those. So you may see that the sections aren't just lining up. All right, so we are going to look at 52.2 and walk through some notes on that. Let me move my head out of the way. Go way over here. All right. So for 52.2 and 52.4, they're going to have two terms here that we don't use hardly at all. Whenever you're told to define, we know what a definition is. And a list, usually we're told to do one or the other. Define, we don't use much. List, they do. Every once in a while use that. You don't have to, like if it just said list, you could make a sentence and state biotic factors are this, comma, this, comma, this. Like that's a list. You don't have to go into it. You don't have to go and say what things are. Here they do tell us, tell me what biotic and abiotic mean, and then describe those. So I don't know why this is so difficult for people, but people really struggle with some of this. We're going to do the squiggle underneath it if it's a term we need to know. So I made that up. It's called a buzzword. It's just a way for you to know that those are going to be terms that they're going to use in a type of test question, and they're not going to tell you what they are. They expect you to know what those are. So let's start off with that. I'm going to do exactly what they say. So I'm going to define these first, and then I'm going to list them. So biotic factors they're going to deal with living things. So they're the factors that are about. So biotic factors are associated with would probably be a good word. Associated with living things. So that would be a definition there. I don't have a number. I think I'm going to number it. And then abiotic factors, they're going to be associated with non-living things. Okay, they also said to list those. So the way that living things, so let's think about this. Let's go here. This is really question number one. So for biotic factors, they're going to have this relationship with living things and living things with their environment. So it's going to be the relationship of living things with their environment and how that those are going to be. That's why they're the relationship that the living things have with the environment and the influence. So some examples of those would be predation. That would be an example of a biotic factor. So it's going to be where that it's a relationship with living things. So living things have the ability to have prey-predator relationships, all of your isms, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, so let's go through these real quick. Predation, since we're talking about this is a relationship between a living things in an environment, so predation is going to be between two living things where one benefits and one's harmed. The same thing for parasitism. One benefits, one's harmed. Mutualism, they both benefit, like a bee and a flower. Commensalism, one's benefited and the other one's not affected. So I don't really believe these, honestly, in nature, but you've got some examples where that you have birds that eat the stuff that's around other organisms, but the other organisms really don't get affected by that. I think that for these, because this is all about relationships, and this is going to be for living things, that's the kind of things you're going to want to talk about. So let's think about some other ones. Living things have the relationship with each other and with their environment of competition. And believe it or not, competition is a negative. And here's the thing. If I didn't have to compete for the resources, I'd be better off. So both competitors, don't always think this is harmed, but it's less favorable than if they didn't have to compete. So that's the way that is. Another one here is disease. That's biotic. So a good way, and I'm going to summarize it like this, biotic factors have to do with numbers of individuals. They're influenced by or created because of living things. So predations between two living things, parasitism, living. Disease is going to increase because there's more organisms, decrease when there's less. So it has to do with the living things, so relationships with living things, and sometimes the number of living things. So, for example, competition would increase if you had higher numbers. Disease increase if you have higher numbers of living things in the environment. So those are some examples of biotic factors. So let's think about abiotic factors. So these don't really have to do with living things. These are things that you could talk about that don't deal with the relationship of living things or numbers. So, for example, factors in an environment that are abiotic would be water, oxygen, pH, salinity, the nutrients in the soil, temperature, light, the structure of the soil. If there's a fire, if there's any type of like weather event, how much moisture there is in an area. So all of these factors in an environment don't have anything to do with the living things being there or not. So if there's a pond, there's a pond. It doesn't matter if there's living things or not. You're still going to have that water. So think about these. These are a lot of times they're going to be like characteristics of the environment without living things in it. So you would be able to designate what the resources are, the water, the oxygen, the light, what would be the things that could affect it, the fire, the wind, moisture, sunlight, all of those. So these are going to be, there's no relationship with these based on living things being there. So that's kind of the way I think about it. If you tell me water's going to be there whether there's a living thing or not in the environment. If you tell me predation can't occur in an environment without living things. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I'm going to bring a picture up. Hold on, because I do like that. That's my notes. Okay. If you you only knew how long that actually took while I was on pause, it was kind of crazy. So I wanted to pull up these figures, 52.7. I don't know about 52.6. We can answer that question without it. And then the seaweed question. And then I want to talk to you about this part at the bottom. We're going to do something different than biomes. We really don't do biomes anymore. So the question, all of this is trying to make the point that there's interactions that living things have with their environment and with each other, and that there's environmental non-living components. And all of those really influence what an organism can do as far as existing in that area. So if there's already pre-existing organisms and they're moving into that area because, let's say, there's water and there's light, these abiotic factors, they're going to run into competition if they're needing the same resources. So we're getting into those kinds of things, like what would keep things, organisms, from just living everywhere? Like, why can't they just live everywhere? And inside, we know that's the case. Like, we know good and well I can't go to Antarctica and just live. And it's not where humans are found. And we know that, but we don't have the vocabulary or the way of describing that we need. That's what we're developing. So let's look at these cattle egrets. They're just a bird that tend to follow herds of cattle. And it says, explain. So explain has two parts to it. The first part is you're going to tell what, like what is it, what's going on, and then you add the why it matters. So why it's important. Okay, so let me bring this figure up. So the egrets are over here where my head is. So let me move it. Okay, they're on this side. So there's a little bird standing on the back of some type of cattle. And what they've shown you based on just color intensity is the dispersal pattern, or where they're located in space over time. And it's really fuzzy because I had to copy it because I couldn't get anything to open. You don't need to hear the story about that. But anyway, technology. So let's just look through here and see what's going on. So in the 40s, you had just some birds right here. And then they started moving along the coast. And in the 50s, they're found in this area and moving on up through Central America and through here. And in the 60s, by the time you get to the 60s, they've made it into Florida. And then over time, they've expanded their area. They're dispersed in space on up through most of the United States. And then they've moved on down the coast, down through here. So if we describe that dispersal, the first thing you want to do is you want to give the person, because really, I mean, if you think about when you're writing an answer, you're trying to convince somebody that you are able to do certain types of work. So the first one, they gave you a map. Can you read the map? So that's what you want to start with. So you would start with, let me go back over here. And this is 2. Oh, seriously? Okay. All right. Move my head. So for question 2, we're going to start off with the map. So we would start with that cattle egrets. They're not found everywhere, right? So you could state that originally in the 1940s, they were found in one area, right? But over, I guess we want to say 3 decades, because really it was about the 70s and then it said current, but over 3 decades, they dispersed, and they dispersed along the coast. You don't have to really even know your geography to be able to use a map. So they moved along the coast and they moved northward. And that was a much larger area that they could be found in. To be found in much more areas. How about many more areas? Many more areas. Okay. So talk about natural range. Let me move this down here on my head. Involve the terms natural range and expansion. So their original natural range was where they first started. So in that small area. So that their original natural range was, let's go back to the picture, make sure we're going to stay where we want. It's right here, right? So that's coastal. And they've expanded their range, that's expansion, and expanded their range over time. So something just super simple. I can look at a map. I can see they started here. I can see that over time, they expanded their range. That's really just the big story from that picture. So what we can take from that, it must mean that these new areas are okay for them to live in. They're not like Antarctica for us, okay? So that they're able to expand, and as their conditions are suitable. So that's the last thing I would write, which would say indicating the environmental conditions in these new areas. The environmental conditions are suitable. Okay? So I get the big picture. They go where they can. It doesn't happen immediately. It's just expansion over time. So I'm going to use the same figure, and let's see what would limit them. So here's what I'm thinking. The main thing I notice is it's much hotter here in the south than it is up here in the north. So I'm thinking that here in their original territory, they had to be in coastal areas and they couldn't live in the interior. My guess, it's too hot. As they move upward, that's all coastal. That's all coastal. But then they get to expand where it's not coastal, like they're in the interior, but it's cooler. So you could say for the next one, which I'm guessing is 3, that it appears that initially, which I would just put in the 1940s, dispersal was limited to coastal areas. Coastal areas, okay. And then, but cooler northern areas were later part of the expansion. Because I can tell from the map that it's cooler up in the north than it is down in the south. So just a simple thing. Sometimes you feel like, oh, I'm stating the obvious. You are, but you have to prove that you know what you're looking at. Okay, so let's look at 4. So how is potential range different from actual range? This has been on a test before. It's really big deal. So how does behavior play a role in limiting distribution and habitat selection? So think about that. So potential range is everywhere you could live. So potential range, everywhere that it's possible to live. Okay? Actual range is where you are actually found. So just making some other statements. So I've gone ahead and I've explained what these are. This potential range is everywhere that an organism has the possibility of living. Actual range is where you're going to find it. It's not going to be in the whole potential range. So if we think of it again like a subset, here's potential range. Actual range may look like this. So actual range is less than the potential range. The reason being is that this is where this organism is able to compete and exist successfully. As you move out here, if there weren't other organisms, it would probably be fine for it to live there. But there's something out here that's keeping them from being able to move out here. So this is usually due to competition. And that's going to limit. So that limits expansion. I'm writing really messy. Into all of the potential range. So you just, yes, I could survive here, but here I exist and I compete and I am able to survive. When it gets out here, I could live here except. So that's the thing. It's the I could live here except. There's another organism that outcompetes me. It's cooler and at the very limit of what I'm able to survive in. So this is where I'm actually found. I'm the most successful here. Okay. Now we're going to look at another figure. And this figure is from the book. So let's go find it. There it is, right here. Gotta move my head. My head's always in the way. So this figure right here. So you pause the video. I'll probably put it in Edpuzzle and you won't have to. And take a little bit of time and see if you can describe this graph to me. So you're going to want to get the picture of what they're showing you. Always go to the title. It figures that this gets cut off. It's feeding by urchins, limit seaweed distribution. So this is going to be what you're really looking at. You're measuring seaweed distribution and you're seeing what is limiting the ability of the seaweed to be everywhere. Okay? So let's go through what this means. Let's look at this. I want to say several things. Like I want to just dissect this graph apart. The first thing I want to notice is that there's time over a couple of seasons. I don't know where this is located. I don't know what the seasons are, but I do know that what it seems like as far as environment in August is different than February. And we did this over more than 1 year. So we're looking at this over more than 1 year based on these time points where we collected data on the seaweed cover. And it was by percent. So there was a chance for this area to have 100% seaweed cover. And we started early in August with no to speak of seaweed cover. So the distribution would be very, very small. Like you have maybe 5% seaweed cover. 95% of the places they can't go. Okay? As time goes on, we have different conditions. So you've got limpets and urchins. They must naturally live in this area because that's the control. The control should be the natural conditions. So I notice, because they're the red, when both the sea urchins and the limpets are there, there's very little seaweed, assuming that they eat it, right? Then you remove the limpets, which means that for the blue, the sea urchins are still there. Limpets are gone, sea urchins are still there. That looks a whole lot like the control. If you remove the urchins, which is the green, and just the limpets are left, the seaweed starts to recover and come in. Takes time to grow. But look at that. You know, you're literally linear. I mean, that's pretty linear to me. That's a really rapid growth of cover that happens when the urchins are removed, so the limpets are here. Now, if you get rid of both of them, which these two are really important, so this is just only the sea urchins are removed. So limpets are eating here. Nothing's eating here. Down here at the bottom, both are eating. And in the blue, the sea urchins are eating. So let's see how we want to talk about this. So can I make you smaller? I can. Let's do it. All right. So I'm going to put what I'm writing here so we can see both. And I'm going to move my head. Okay. So I'm going to write that this is a graph of seaweed distribution. Distribution is dispersal, location in space. So this is based on a percent. So the graph of this seaweed distribution is going to have very different conditions. So the graph demonstrates, is that what I want to say? I don't think I want to say that. I'm going to say indicates. Less strong word, but still strong enough. Indicates that when no limpets or urchins, where'd my R go? It's supposed to be an R, but I think I dropped it. Urchins are present. I'm going to put that seaweed, I'm going to keep using the same words because this is what we're looking at. Let's change this to cover because over here they said cover. Seaweed cover as a percent increases rapidly, right? Now, does it go forever and ever? Well, no, because you can't go over 100%. But it goes increases rapidly from August of 1982 to August of 1983 and levels out at 95%. That's what I'm going with. 95% cover. Then I'm going to put that when sea urchins are present, because they're the main munchers, because I look down here and this is where they are, the limpets are removed, the sea urchins remain. The percent cover is approximately the same as the control with both limpets and urchins present. So if I stopped there, that gives the indication that the sea urchins, when they're there, everything's about the same as where when the limpets and the sea urchins are there, which means the limpets don't do a whole lot. So that's why this green graph is important, because there is a decrease in cover when you have just the limpets. And then I'm going to tell you what the big story of this is. So now I'm going to put, but when only what? Limpets are present, there is a decrease in percent cover from no urchins, limpets. So they do something. All right, all of this right here is me demonstrating I know what happened here. So here's what they're wanting from you. If you have a question, I'm just going to make this up. Let's say it's 5 points. You'd have probably 2 points here, maybe 3. So you definitely, these are the simple things. Like I'm just stating what I see. Maybe I don't even understand what I'm seeing, but I can still state what the graph says. Now I want to explain like what the takeaway is. So what's the big takeaway? So let's think about it. When you have both urchins and limpets present, there's pretty much no seaweed cover. Looks a whole lot like this next one when there's just sea urchins. So there must be competition between the sea urchins and the limpets must be less fit. The sea urchins must outcompete the limpets, because when they're together and there's competition, there's very little cover. If you remove the limpets, there's still very little cover. So the sea urchins are the better competitor. But if you just put the poor little limpets in there and go, hey, guess what would you do if this was a potential thing for you? Like, we don't have any urchins here. What could you do? Well, I can eat seaweed. I can. I don't usually get any because those stupid urchins get it all. So that's the takeaway. The takeaway is that there's competition for the resource of food, which is the seaweed, and this is between the urchins and the limpets. Is that an E? It looks funny. With the urchins being the better competitor. They outcompete the limpets. How do you know this? Then you would say that the reason for this is, I know this from the graph, so here's why I'm saying that. You showed me that the limpets do eat it. So the green told me that the limpets do feed on the seaweed. So there is competition for that. And then down here you told me that when, what color is that? Blue. That blue told me that the urchins are going to be the primary reason for the reduction in the percent cover. Because when they're present, I'm over here pointing like you can see, when they're present, it looks like the control. Okay? So I guess I'm not going to do the biomes. I'm going to hold off on this one. So we need to do, so we'll do later, because we're going to do these different. We don't do biomes, but we do want to look at temperature and precipitation graphs, and I'll bring some up and show them to you. Maybe I'll put those in another packet if you're still at home, or we'll put them as glue-ins if you're here, and that way you can see what they look like, not have to draw them. Okay? All right. I know this was long, but you can pause. You're the best.